On April 8th, 2026, at 8 in the morning inside a nondescript government building in Paris, a small interministerial seminar convened 3 state agencies at once: the Directorate General for Enterprise, the National Agency for Information System Security, and the State Procurement. By that afternoon, they had produced a single directive that would end up rattling boardrooms in Redmond, Washington, thousands of miles away. France's Interministerial Digital Directorate, known as DINAM, announced it was migrating its own workstations off Windows and onto Linux, and it wasn't stopping there. Every single ministry in the French government was ordered to submit a formal plan by autumn 2026 to eliminate its dependency on non-European digital infrastructure entirely. Systems, cloud platforms, collaboration tools, even artificial intelligence systems. All of it on the table with a deadline attached. 2.5 million civil servants. That's how many desks this directive touches. That's roughly the population of a mid-sized European country, all being told, on orders, to stop using the operating system that has run their computers for the last 3 decades. Microsoft didn't see this coming out of nowhere, and that's exactly what should worry you about how fast this has escalated. 3 months earlier, in January 2026, France had already issued a binding mandate ripping Microsoft Teams and Zoom out of every government department and replacing them with a homegrown platform called Visio, built on the open-source end-to-end encrypted protocol Jitsi. That single move alone should have been the headline of the year. Instead, it was just the opening move. French Minister for Public Accounts, David Amiel, stood in front of cameras and said, in translated remarks, that the country could no longer accept not having control over its own data and digital infrastructure, that this was about regaining control of France's digital destiny. Words like that don't usually come attached to an IT procurement decision. They come attached to something that feels a lot more like a declaration. Here's the part that makes this genuinely alarming if you're sitting inside Microsoft's European sales division right now. France didn't invent this playbook. It copied it from a police force. Since 2008, the French Gendarmerie has quietly run over 100,000 computers on a customized, hardened version of Ubuntu Linux, nicknamed Gendbuntu, without ever making international headlines for it. It's been working, uninterrupted, for 18 years inside one of the most security-sensitive institutions in the country. When DINAM needed proof that a national-scale Linux migration wasn't a fantasy, it didn't have to look far. It had nearly 2 decades of quiet, boring, functional evidence sitting inside its own police force. And layered on top of that, there's CHAP, an encrypted messaging app built on the Matrix protocol, developed by DINAM itself, already deployed to more than 600,000 French civil servants, roughly 1 in every 4 government employees in the entire country, all communicating on infrastructure that owes nothing to Silicon Valley. Now here's where the panic should really start to set in. If you've been assuming this is just a French thing, some Gallic anti-American posturing that'll fizzle out the way it usually does, it isn't isolated, it's a pattern. And the pattern has been accelerating for 2 years. Go back to 2024, to the German state of Schleswig-Holstein, which quietly began its own migration away from Microsoft, moving toward a homegrown Linux distribution alongside LibreOffice, Nextcloud, OpenExchange, and Thunderbird. By early 2026, that state had converted nearly 80% of its roughly 30,000 government workstations, and in the process saved 15 million euros in licensing costs in a single year. 15 million euros. One German state, 1 year. That number alone should be setting off alarms in every finance department that budgets for Microsoft 365 subscriptions across the continent, especially now, because starting in July 2026, Microsoft is raising Microsoft 365 pricing by as much as 16.7%, a price hike that, if anything, is only going to accelerate the exodus it was presumably meant to help offset. And it doesn't stop at 2 countries. Austria adopted a formal charter on digital sovereignty in the summer of 2025. By that winter, all 27 member states of the European Union had signed onto that same charter during the Summit on European Digital Sovereignty. Amsterdam published a multi-year digital autonomy strategy, stretching all the way to 2035. Denmark and the Netherlands have both taken concrete first steps. This is no longer a handful of stubborn IT departments annoyed at license renewal costs. This is now, formally, on paper, signed by every government in the European Union, a continent-wide political commitment. So why now? Why did this movement, which honestly limped along for over a decade with almost nothing to show for it, suddenly explode into the most aggressive tech policy shift Europe has made in a generation? The answer is uncomfortable if you're an American company, and it traces directly back to Washington. Starting in April 2025, tariffs imposed by the Trump administration reignited Europe's underlying anxiety about how much of its digital infrastructure sits entirely inside American hands. And the number behind that anxiety is staggering once you actually look at it. American cloud providers control an estimated 85% of the entire European cloud computing market, according to Synergy Research Group. 85%. Three companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, effectively holding the digital nervous system of an entire continent's governments, hospitals, courts, and militaries. European sovereign cloud spending is now forecast to more than triple, hitting 23 billion euros by 2027. And French cloud providers OVH Cloud and Scaleway have both reported record client growth since the tariffs hit, as institutions across Europe scramble to move workloads off American servers before the next geopolitical shock arrives. Before you assume this story only has one direction, that Europe flips a switch and Microsoft simply vanishes from the continent, there's a ghost that every single official pushing this migration is acutely aware of, and its name is Munich. Back in 2003, the city of Munich launched one of the most ambitious government Linux migrations in history, a custom distribution called Linux, built specifically to get city workstations off Windows entirely. For over a decade, it was held up worldwide as proof that a major Western city could actually do this. And then, in 2017, Munich reversed course and moved back to Microsoft. The failure became a cautionary tale repeated in every boardroom. Presentation about why government open source migrations don't work, cited for years by exactly the people who wanted to prove digital sovereignty, was a fantasy. Italo Vignoli, a founding member of the Document Foundation, the organization behind LibreOffice, has been blunt about what actually went wrong in Munich. The city treated the migration purely as a technology project instead of a political and organizational one. And when political will wavered, the whole thing collapsed under its own weight. That single historical failure is exactly why what's happening now looks structurally different, and exactly why Microsoft should be more worried this time than it was in 2017. France's mandate isn't coming from one city council that can be lobbied and reversed by a change in local leadership. It's coming from the national government simultaneously. Every single ministry, coordinated by Dynam, with a hard deadline for every ministry to formalize its own roadmap by autumn 2026. There's no single mayor to lobby, no single local election to wait out. And the geopolitical backdrop of 2026 bears almost no resemblance to 2003 or even 2017. Back then, digital sovereignty was a niche concern for privacy advocates and open source hobbyists. Today, it's discussed in the same breath as military strategy and national security, treated as core infrastructure policy at the level of energy independence, not as an IT budgeting exercise. None of which means Microsoft goes down without a fight, or that this transition is anywhere close to finished. Buried inside Denham's own directive is an acknowledgement that certain categories of government software, particularly in defense, healthcare, and financial regulation, remain deeply, stubbornly tied to Windows-specific applications that don't have a clean Linux, equivalent applications built and maintained over decades that can't simply be swapped out on a government timeline. And there's a structural irony sitting quietly underneath this entire sovereignty push that almost nobody wants to say out loud. Even as France rips Windows off government desktops and replaces Teams with Visio, some of the continent's most ambitious new technology ventures, including a recent cohort of European AI startups selected for Amazon's own AWS Accelerator program, are still being built and scaled entirely on American cloud infrastructure. You can replace the operating system sitting on top of the stack, replacing the cloud and compute layer underneath it. The actual foundation everything else runs on is an entirely different, far harder war, one that hasn't even properly started yet. So where does this actually leave Microsoft, a company that has spent literal decades building an empire on top of European government desks? The honest answer is nervous, and rightly so, but not yet defeated. TechRadar put it plainly earlier this year, warning that if Windows 11 keeps shipping the kind of bugs and rough patches that have plagued its recent updates, and users keep watching France complete a mass government migration successfully while comparing notes with the growing crowd of Windows defectors complaining on Reddit, the exodus won't stay confined to government buildings. It could start bleeding into ordinary consumer choices too, especially with Apple's more affordable MacBook line already picking up unexpected momentum as a Windows alternative. That's the nightmare scenario sitting quietly behind all of this for Microsoft. Not a single dramatic loss, but a slow, compounding credibility problem where every successful government migration becomes another data point proving that life without Windows is not just possible, but often cheaper, and where every price hike, every buggy update, every year of licensing costs climbing while European alternatives quietly mature pushes the tipping point a little closer. Because here's what nobody arguing about qubits or GPUs or the next great AI model is talking about, and it's the thing that should actually stick with you after all these numbers. This isn't really a story about which operating system boots faster or looks nicer on a desktop. It's a story about an entire continent looking at where its most sensitive data physically lives, who controls the servers, who could theoretically flip a switch during the next trade dispute or the next tariff war, and deciding, one country at a time, that the answer can no longer be a handful of American companies, indefinitely, no questions asked. France just put a hard deadline on that answer. Germany already has receipts proving it can work, 27. Countries have signed a charter saying they intend to follow. And Microsoft, the company that has run the desktops of European democracy for 30 years, almost entirely unchallenged, now has until autumn 2026 to prove that the empire it built on institutional habit and vendor lock-in can survive a continent that has finally decided habit isn't good enough anymore.